Hello, welcome to our fourth and final installment of our video PowerPoints on the removal of the Creek and the Cherokee. During the Revolutionary War, many Native Americans fought as allies with the British. And the reason they did so is because the British promised to return the land that had been taken by white settlers if the British won the war. But since the British should not win the war, and when the war was over, the people of Georgia, they began to push the Native Americans off of more and more of their land, as did the rest of the new United States. There were two major groups that were located in Georgia, the Creek and the Cherokee. The Creek were prominent in the southern and western parts of Georgia, and they did not want to give up their land. They did have one chief, Alexander McGillivray, who was the son of a Scottish trader, and he was a half French, half Creek mother, and he led the Creeks in resisting white expansion. During the war, he led raids on settlements in Georgia and Tennessee, and this is what is presumed to be what he looked like because there's no photographs, only drawings. As you can see, this is a drawing. Now, in 1790, McGillivray met with the new president, George Washington, in hopes of settling some of these disputes between the Creeks and the people of Georgia. They signed the Treaty of New York, which had the Creeks give up some of their land in exchange for a promise that settlers would not move west beyond a certain point. And of course, it did not take long for the government to break that promise. Then in 1823, a new chief is in power with the Creeks, Chief McIntosh, and he is working against Georgia at this time. So Governor at the time, George Troup, pressures the federal government to drive the Creeks from their remaining land. Troup is first cousins with McIntosh, who is the son of a Scottish officer and a Creek woman. Now, because they're cousins, McIntosh was willing to negotiate with Troup and signed away the last of the Creek lands to the state of Georgia in the Treaty of Indian Springs, much to his disappointment, I would believe. And here is a picture of William McIntosh. We'll talk a little bit more about McIntosh here. This treaty he signed greatly angered his people. Now, the rule was if a Creek chief were to sign a treaty, he had to have the permission of the tribe to do so. Well, McIntosh did not get that permission because he was working with his cousin. And the reason he signed the treaty is because he got paid a couple $100,000 to do so. So, his people, greatly angered, stabbed McIntosh to death, took his scalp, and murdered other leaders who had signed the treaty. They also burned his house down, which his body was in the house. He was already dead, but just to make sure, let's burn the house down to make sure he's totally dead. And so even though McIntosh is dead and he's the one who signed the treaty is still enacted, and by 1827, the Creeks had been relocated to the wilderness across the Mississippi River. And you can see these are the areas over time that the Creeks gave away their land in Georgia. They ceded it. A cession is a giving away of your land, or ceding land means to give it away. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Cherokee were the other major Native American tribe in Georgia. They lived mainly in North Georgia and western North Carolina. They were accommodationists, as often they're called, which means they adapted to white society. They built houses to look like white society. They had a government very similar to the U.S. government with 3 branches of government and a constitution. They did things very much like the white man. And they farmed, they owned slaves, and so they felt that this somehow sheltered them from what the Creek had dealt with. So here's where I mentioned the Cherokee were located, again, predominantly in this portion of Georgia, and then this little bit of North Carolina, which still has an active Cherokee reservation and has a casino and has a great outdoor play during the summer called Unto These Hills, and still has a lot of Cherokee influences. In fact, it's called Cherokee, North Carolina, and I'll come back to this later and explain why. Now, one of the Cherokee's most famous members was Sequoyah. His English name was George Gist because his father was a Virginian and his mother was a Cherokee. He created what's known as the Cherokee alphabet that enabled the tribe to read, write, and publish its own newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. This newspaper contributed to the unification of the Cherokee Nation because it helped the tribe members communicate. So if they were living in different states, they might be different Cherokee nations. With the Cherokee Phoenix and this new language, it's called a syllabary, they were able to communicate with each other that they weren't able to do before. So the alphabet was called a syllabary because it was actually a grouping of syllables instead of individual letters. And so here is Sequoyah and an example of the Cherokee Phoenix, one of the early editions. Now, the main chief of the Cherokee at this time was John Ross, and he signed a treaty in 1791 guaranteeing that the Cherokee Nation could be an independent nation and have its own government. And like I said before, they modeled it after the U.S. government. Ross was the son of a Scottish father and part Cherokee, part Scottish mother. And here's a picture of him. He does not look very stereotypical Native American with the headdress and things. That was not a typical attire for the Cherokee. Like I said, they were accommodationists. They tried to appear as much like white society as possible, so they felt that could protect them. So what becomes the problem? Why did the Cherokee end up having to be removed? Well, it's because of the gold rush. The first discovery of gold, the first American gold rush, was in Dahlonega, Georgia, and thousands of people flooded into North Georgia to get rich. And this eventually leads to the settlers pressuring the Cherokee and the Georgia General Assembly to give up, to get rid of the Cherokee and denying rights to the Cherokee because they wanted the land and they wanted the gold. Okay, and here are some pictures of the Dahlonega Gold Rush. Another important aspect of the Cherokee removal is the Worcester v. Georgia case. Georgia law stated that whites could not help the Cherokee and they could not live on Cherokee territory without swearing an oath of allegiance to the governor. Now, Samuel Worcester was a Christian missionary and he did not want to take this oath. He was like, I'm a Christian. My duty is to help the oppressed. I should not have to take this oath if I want to live amongst the Cherokee and help them, which he did. He was living amongst the Cherokee. He lived on their land. So they sentenced him to prison. And he ultimately appeals his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is a picture of Worcester. He was a minister. Now, when this case is being battled, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at the time was John Marshall. And Marshall said that Georgia must free Worcester because Georgia laws were not valid in Cherokee territory. Going back to that treaty that's signed by John Ross, they are an independent nation. Their land is independent of the U.S. government. But now the U.S. government is saying, no, you're not independent of it if you have white settlers living on your land. The Georgia government is enraged by Justice Marshall's verdict in this case and ruling in this case that they have to set Worcester free. And here's a picture of John Marshall. Now the president gets involved and he's frustrated by the decision, and his role as the president is to enforce it. But he says, no, I'm not going to enforce it. He refuses to, he backs up Georgia and says, you don't have to release Worcester. Basically, he says to them, you know what? Marshall's made his decision. Let him come down there and enforce it. This is not the exact quoting that Jackson gave, but the quote that he gave that's basically what it means, is if Marshall has made this decision, he needs to enforce it, because I, as president, am not going to enforce it, even though that was his role as president to enforce it. Because Jackson believed in Indian removal, felt that it was the desire of God for them to be removed in a way. And he wanted to get the Cherokee out of Georgia. And here is President Andrew Jackson. So Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which ultimately leads to the U.S. government forcing the Cherokee to give up all of their lands in Georgia. And in 1838, they began rounding up those that did not leave on their own, because many of them left on their own for fear of what could happen to them if they did not leave. But there were about 14,000 of them that said, nope, we're not going to leave. And they were forced to leave on an 800-mile march to Oklahoma. Now, they left in a time period where they had to march through winter, and many died from exposure, starvation, because they did not have food. They did not bring ample food. They brought enough food for the Army soldiers, but not for the actual Cherokee that were having to be forced. They did not all go on ways that had methods of getting access to water, and many of them had to leave in the middle of the night, and they were not able to take the appropriate clothing attire that they would need for this march. And so that's where the exposure comes in. They don't have the winter clothes to deal with this march, and that's why some of them die. So this journey is ultimately remembered as the Trail of Tears. And it went from here, really goes from about here in New Echota, which was the capital of the Cherokee, and it took a few different routes, the land route, and it took a water route, and you can see it follows various rivers, and then there were a couple other routes that they took. Some visual images. This one here is a very famous image of the Cherokee removal. You can see they were basically arrested and taken from their homes in just what they're wearing here. And you can see she has no shoes. And so she was told, get going, get moving. You have like 5 minutes, pack up, and we're going. So they really didn't have the appropriate warning when the final removal came. Now, let me go back to that map and talk about, again, why this is called Cherokee, North Carolina. Now, there were Cherokee that were living in these 3 other states. Most of them, again, the ones in Tennessee and Alabama, yes, were removed as well, but the most significant removal was here in Georgia. Many of them left on their own, like I said before. There were some that stayed, and then they were forcibly removed in very quick fashion. But then there were some that escaped, and they hid in the mountains of North Carolina. And they went to North Carolina, and they hid there for several days, weeks, months, until they felt it was safe. And then they came out of hiding, and that's where we get the town of Cherokee, North Carolina, because of the Cherokee that hid in the woods there in the forests, and then created a new settlement for themselves. Some of them came from Georgia. Some of them were already in North Carolina, and they hid. But there were a lot of Cherokee that came from Georgia and went into the North Carolina mountains, and that's where we get that Native American influence in Cherokee, North Carolina today. That is our 4th and final installment. Again, you can come back and watch these videos as many times as you need to get a reinforcement of information. You can come and ask questions. And I hope you've enjoyed learning in this method, and we'll be doing a survey about that to kind of gauge how you feel about learning in this new style and method. Thank you.